Alright. Hello again, Adventures, and welcome to another exciting episode of my daily vlog. This is daily vlog number, I don't know, what is it? 63, I think? Math is hard. So, today, I want to talk about, game mechanics and game design and stuff like that again because again it's something that's big on my brain right now. So I want to talk about dual wielding. The reason why dual wielding in general has been this weird hill to die on for quite a few different debates about RPGs in general. There's always the idea of the martial versus caster disparity, which, if you're not familiar, basically, the best way to describe it is in D&D, which is where it originates, and it tends to bleed over into quite a few other RPGs that are similar to D&D. Effectively, martial classes increase in a linear fashion, whereas caster classes increase in power, specifically, in an exponential fashion. And if you're not familiar with those terms, they describe graphs. A linear equation is something to the effects of y equals mx plus b, where y is your coordinate on your vertical graph line thing. Axis, vertical axis, x is the value on the horizontal axis. M is the, I can't remember what it's called anymore. It's been a long time. M basically multiplies the thing, so that will change the slope of the line. And then the last number, the plus b, will change its position along the x-axis where it crossed the x-axis. It's a really, really simplistic thing, and it's very, very easy to understand. It is a line, and the only thing you can do is change how steep the line is, but that's all that ever happens. It's always a line. It's extremely easy to predict. Exponential graphs are specifically a graph created by the equation y equals m to the x. And basically what that does is it starts off very slow, and then as x gets larger, the slope increases to where it gets big very, very fast. So on an exponential graph, it will start off like this and then do that. So the reason they say that fighters increase linearly while casters increase exponentially is a low-level caster is next to worthless, especially if you go way back to like 2nd edition or first edition D&D. You generally would have single-digit hit points, which is true of most classes, but single-digit hit points for a wizard was like 2. Or if you rolled real bad, it was 1, which meant anything could knock you unconscious. And it generally meant if you took 1 hit as a wizard at a low level in 1st edition, the character was just dead. However, and their ability to cast spells is extremely limited. You generally had only like 2 or 3 spells per day, and that included your cantrips, depending on which edition you were dealing with. And so that meant after you had effectively taken 2 or 3 turns in an entire day, you were done for the day. You didn't do anything, and those low-level spells generally did very little damage. Again, especially if you're dealing with cantrips where they might do only 1 or 2 points of damage. Fighters, on the other hand, they weren't super powerful at that point, but they could take a hit and they could do decent damage, and then as they grow in a very predictable fashion. However, fast forward to wizards, generally around level 5, you can start casting fireballs and doing hundreds of damage if there's enough creatures in the area, and then it just gets more and more powerful for that. So two-weapon fighting has been used as kind of an answer to that aspect, but then it also gets nerfed quite a bit because we don't want to make two-weapon fighting the only way you can keep up. And so there's always these really weird rules for two-weapon fighting to prevent two-weapon fighting being the only choice you can take. If we look at first edition, technically didn't have two-weapon fighting. You generally could, but you could only have a dagger or a hand axe in your offhand, and it really didn't change much. We get to second edition, that's when they really introduced two-weapon fighting, and they created the kind of normal rules for two-weapon fighting that exists in just about every D20-based game, which is if you are two-weapon fighting, you get a single additional attack made by your offhand, but it makes all of your attacks significantly more likely to miss. And by significantly, I mean your main hand attack gets a -6 to its attack roll, and your offhand attack gets a -10. Yeah, effectively, you cannot hit with two-weapon fighting at low levels in either second edition or the third edition. Now, there are ways to offset that. If your offhand weapon was a light weapon, it would subtract, or it would add 2 to both of those. So instead of -6 and -10, it turned to -4 and -8. There was a couple different feats you can get, including ambidexterity, which got rid of the idea of an offhand, and then the two-weapon fighting feats and things, or the dual wielding feats, whatever they were called. All stuff like that. But it's basically meant to give people a reason to want to use something other than two-weapon fighting. Like, you don't want your sword and board fighters to be at a massive, massive disadvantage compared to two wielders. Or the people that are using two-handed weapons, you don't want them going, well, I want to be this cool, like, big, great sword or great axe wielding person, but this other person that's just wielding a pair of daggers is just out-damaging me 1,000,000,000% to 1. And so they create all these different limitations. And you see it in other RPGs as well, as they find ways to severely limit two-weapon fighting so as not to make it effectively the quote-unquote right choice. And a bunch of different systems treat it differently. And for the most part, none of them have really felt great to me. As far as two-weapon fighting is considered, it always feels less fun. I mean, there are ways to, like, if in D&D 5th edition, the way that they do two-weapon fighting is it doesn't affect your attack rolls at all, which is great. I hated that immensely. But what it was is both weapons have to be light for the default version of two-weapon fighting. And the way that it works is for your bonus action, you can make an attack with your offhand weapon, and the only difference is you don't add your damage modifier to it. So let's say you're wielding a pair of scimitars, really common two-weapon fighting weapon, and you've got a +3 to your dex, and using dexterity because they're finesse weapons. So your first attack at level 1 is going to be a +5. So +5 to attack, and then when you hit with it, scimitar does a d6 of damage. It's 1d6 plus your dexterity mod. And then for your bonus action, you can attack with your other one. It's still a +6 to hit, but when you deal damage, it's only a d6. You lose that 3 points of damage. And then as you level up and you get things like extra attacks, you only ever, throughout the entirety of the game, you can only ever get one additional attack with two-weapon fighting. So the idea of giving up either a shield or the ability to use two-handed weapons, which generally have much larger damage dice, is one additional attack that uses your bonus action, which might, depending on your class, might be used for something else. Like rogues in general really don't benefit from two-weapon fighting ever, because sneak attack is can only happen once per turn, and rogues are already very bonus action focused because of their cunning action. There's so many different things they can do with their bonus action that it's basically a waste of time to just get a kind of piddling amount of the damage with your bonus action instead of being able to dash or disengage for free or for your bonus action or to be able to hide. Like, those are significantly better, and most of the rogue subclasses give you some other aspect of cunning action that you can use. So when you're thinking about kind of the power fantasy of two-weapon fighting, when you look at how it works in 5th edition, it's really kind of boring because for the most part you have your main weapon, you're going yeah 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 and doing cool stuff, and then you go poke, and that's it. And so your offhand weapon is mostly useless. Now, flavor-wise and mechanics-wise, theoretically, if you have extra attack, you can attack with either weapon. So theoretically, instead of it being yeah 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 yeah, if you're a two-weapon fighting fighter that already has, once you hit level 11, you've got 3 attacks already. This will give you a 4th. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4. And that works perfectly well. And again, if you have 2 different magic weapons that do different things when they attack, that might be beneficial. But it still just doesn't feel great because you could just as easily get rid of the second weapon and two-hand the weapon you have, or get a greatsword or something, and you still get 3 attacks. You just don't get the extra poke. And so it really doesn't feel very good. If we go back to 2nd edition or 3rd edition D&D or Pathfinder 1st edition, and I think it's relatively similar in 2nd edition. I haven't read my 2nd edition books in a while. But two-weapon fighting is useless at low levels. You just can't do it. In general, you cannot do two-weapon fighting until minimum if you're a ranger, which gets bonuses to two-weapon fightings if you choose that version of a ranger. You can sometimes get most of your attacks to hit. And I mean, by most, I mean barely 51% of your attacks to hit at like level 3 or 4. But generally, you're not going to be able to use two-weapon fighting until bare minimum level 5 or level 6. And if for whatever reason you rolled bad on your stats, or you had other feats that you wanted to take before that, you might not be able to two-weapon fight until 8, 9, even 10th level. Because the penalties for it are just so overwhelmingly limiting. And then you have to deal, especially once you get into the 3rd edition, you have to deal with the fact that you only get extra attacks when you do a full action attack, which means you can't move and stuff like that. And so, again, the power fantasy of like a drizzed-like character, where you're just going around like it doesn't really exist in 3rd edition, because bare minimum you have to go for 5 levels before you're able to start attacking. And then, even then, you have to root yourself in the ground, and you can only sit there and attack with all of your weapons when you aren't moving and aren't doing anything else. It requires the entirety of the focus of your character, which again doesn't really fit the kind of power fantasy. It also doesn't fit how two-weapon fighting works in actual combat. And this was another thing that, again, was the weirdest hill to die on for the longest time. There are all of these historical weapon experts on YouTube. Apparently, there's been drama in the weapon experts YouTube circles, where some of them are attacking other ones because they're going, well, you don't actually fight with historical weapons, you just study them, and therefore you're not allowed to have an opinion on them. And that turned into a whole thing that I'm not going to get into. I did find it interesting, though. But for a long time, there was this belief that two-weapon fighting is a purely fantastical thing. It was created for books and movies, and it never happened in real life, which is 100% false. And we have tons and tons and tons and tons of evidence that shows that two-weapon fighting was not extremely common, because it does take quite a bit of training and skill to do, but was not rare in any definition of the word. We have books on swordplay from all over the globe that talk specifically about techniques used for two-weapon fightings. Samurai, very often, samurai in general would carry 3 swords on them. They would have their katana, which was the longest and largest of the swords that they would carry. They would have their wakizashi, which was kind of a medium-sized sword. It was generally, size-wise, you could compare it to like a short sword, where like as a katana was this very large, long, curved blade. A wakizashi was close to about this. And there's 2 reasons to carry a wakizashi. One, if you were fighting in close quarters, a lot of times the katana was just too large to be able to fight in a very kind of small area, like a hallway or something, because some samurai were guards and things like that for very high-ranking nobles. So having a shorter sword was nice in close quarters. The other reason you would carry the wakizashi is to wield it in conjunction with your katana. And fight with 2 weapons. Again, it was something that was limited to people that basically devoted their life to swordplay to learn it. And then the 3rd weapon that they carried was a tanto, which the tanto was just a little dagger, and it could be used as a weapon. It also is used for seppuku, which is basically ritualistic suicide. So we have that in Japan. If you go across the water to China, they have quite a few examples throughout kung fu schools and things like that of paired weapons in general. You had paired broadswords, where there was a specific weapon where it was a broadsword that was basically 2 halves of a sword. They were called paired broadswords, and it literally was, you could technically hold them like a very thick-handled broadsword, but when you took them apart, you basically took the sword in half. And the reason it was designed that way was not specifically so they could go from wielding it as one with 2 blades to 2, was to symbolize the idea that they are 2 halves of the same weapon. It was much more for a theological reason than it was because that's how it was designed to be used. But it was very, very, it wasn't extremely common or anything like that, but it was not rare. It just, again, took a lot of effort and training to be able to use these weapons. And we do have, not many, but we do have instances that show these weapons being used on the battlefield, because that's another argument, is that, well, yes, there were some people that did it, but they only really did it for either if you were dueling someone or as a show piece, which Kung Fu in general had a lot of very, very kind of showy aspects to the martial arts. It still does. Kung Fu in and of itself is a very, very visual martial art. It looks extremely pretty. So, yeah. But, man. But we have those things. And then we go, well, that was just over there. In Europe, no one ever used 2 weapons. Not true either. Specifically when we get to fencing and rapiers being the kind of standard sword, there is a specific style of fencing called the Florentine style of fencing. The reason it's called Florentine is because it was developed in Florence, Italy. And the Florentine style of fencing uses 2 rapiers, 2 full-size rapiers. Now, for historical weapon experts have never had a problem with the idea of rapier and buckler fencing or rapier and dagger fencing. But for some odd reason, for the longest time, they're like, well, no one could ever use 2 rapiers. It's impossible to do that. Florentine style of fencing, that's all you did. And the benefit of Florentine style of fencing versus something like rapier and dagger was when you are using rapier and dagger fencing, which is dual wielding, two weapon fighting, you're not actually ever really fighting with the dagger. The dagger is meant as a parrying blade. It's actually remarkably similar to rapier and buckler fencing. And if you're unaware, like a lot of people, when you think of buckler, you just think of kind of like a small shield. That's not technically what a buckler is. A buckler is literally, it's a shield that's about the size of my hand, and it fits over your fist. There's this little kind of dome here, and then it has a small circular out there, so it's about this big, maybe a little bit bigger. And it's very, very mobile, but it's a tiny, tiny shield. And it's really meant to kind of bap weapons out of the way. It's not meant to be used as a shield, whereas a shield, you sit there and it like protects you and you can hit people with it. A buckler is much, much more. It's still a defensive weapon, but much, much faster, and it's meant to kind of slap weapons out of the way. You can punch people with it. It's a really cool weapon. And so rapier and buckler and rapier and dagger are remarkably similar fighting styles where, yes, theoretically it is a weapon. You can attack with it, but for the most part, the only thing you're ever using it for is to parry the opponent's weapon. And so the downside of that is when you are fighting with either rapier and buckler or rapier and dagger, your opponent always knows where your defensive side is and your offensive side is. So they always know if they're going to go towards your anywhere near your parrying dagger, they know that's what your parrying dagger is going to do. And so you become that much more predictable and that much easier to get around. And there's also issues with, especially in fencing, your backhand is used a lot more than just, like, it doesn't just flop there in the wind. You use it for balance. You use it as a way to build momentum and the things like that. So there is a disadvantage to not being able to have your hand back like this, especially when you thrust. You actually kind of toss your backhand up to lift you back up. Ooh, I just pulled something there. Oh, that hurt. So there are definite bad sides to using a rapier and dagger, but there's also useful things about it. But again, it was not an easy thing to learn. You had to learn how to use your other hand in a very, very different fashion than normal fencing. Cue the Florentine style of fencing. With two rapiers, you don't actually have a designated defensive weapon and an offensive weapon. The thing that made Florentine style fencing so formidable, to the point where we actually have tristes that say that after you learn just regular traditional fencing with a single rapier, the most important style of fencing to learn immediately after that is the Florentine style, because it teaches you so much about how to switch from offense to defense instantly. Because the thing that defines, you still have an offensive rapier and a defensive rapier, but the thing that defines which one, the thing that defines which one is which at any given moment is whichever one works the best in that particular position. So it's an extremely versatile form of fencing, because your opponent has no idea if you're going to defend with your left hand, you're going to defend with your right hand. You theoretically can attack with both as well and defend with both. But in general, you're going to kind of be switching between this is one's defending and this one's attacking, and then this one's defending and this one's attacking. And it's really, really interesting and cool. That, again, we've got tons and tons of stuff about that being a real thing that actually happened. And then, like I said, for like a decade, we had all these people just, no, two-weapon fighting is purely fantastical, and if you want a real RPG, it can't have two-weapon fighting because it never worked. No one in history has ever used it. It's really, really stupid. And now, for some odd reason, they've all kind of flipped on that and said, no, it's always been a thing. Yeah, but in general, the reason why most players that are using two-weapon fighting want to use two-weapon fighting is because of the power fantasy of it, how cool it looks. And I've been trying to find an RPG where I feel that two-weapon fighting feels as cool as it does in, say like an MMO or something like that, where if you equip two weapons, you just feel really, really cool. And if you look at like World of Warcraft and two weapon warriors, like they are powerhouses. At least they were. It's been a long time since I've played. World of Warcraft, and I was never a warrior player. The two weapon fighting character that I really liked that could go either way, where it could be single weapon or two weapon, was the Death Knight. Because Death Knight, the Frost aspect Death Knight for the longest time was the two weapon one, and it was just really cool because you're constantly going into fighting and you're attacking with both weapons, and then you're constantly like just throwing off these double attacks, and it was really, really fun and really, really cool. And an early Wrath of the Lich King Frost aspect was also the tanking aspect for a little bit, and so you could be a two-weapon fighting tank, which was massively fun. And then they got rid of that, and so Frost is a DPS aspect. But you can be a, Demon Hunter, and they have a tanking spec that uses two weapons. So I like that. I like two-weapon tanking. I just think it's cool. So I keep trying to find RPGs that feel cool. Like, we look at, like, 13th Age. We talked about, in 13th Age, two-weapon fighting literally just means you can re-roll ones, if I remember correctly, on your damage die, I think is what it was. Or something like that. So, again, doesn't give you any extra attacks, doesn't feel extra cool, doesn't really do anything. When we go to 4th Edition, which is what 13th Age was halfway based on, 4th Edition is even worse. Or better, I guess, kind of. 4th Edition, if you're two-weapon fighting, you get a +2 damage bonus to your attacks. And that's it. Unless you take a specific class that has powers that let you do cool two-weapon fighting things. Like the Ranger had quite a few different ones that let you do cool two-weapon fighting things. But that was the only way you ever really got a huge benefit, was you had to be a Ranger. I think Ranger was the only one that really got two-weapon fighting feats, or powers. Which is fine. I mean, again, that's what Ranger was supposed to be cool and good at. And then you look at 5th Edition, again, it's just poke, and that's all you really get with it. And I've been looking at other RPGs, like Fabula Ultima has a two-weapon fighting system that is interesting in the idea that you basically get to make two attacks in your turn. But the way damage is figured in Fabula Ultima is you take your high roll and then you add a modifier to it. So this is if you're rolling, let's say, 2d8s for your attack roll, you roll, you roll a 10. You got an 8 and a 2. Well, that would mean if the 10 hits, then that means you hit the target. And then your high roll's an 8, so you take the 8 and then you add whatever your damage modifier is, and that's how much damage you do. With two-weapon fighting in Fabula Ultima, you get to attack twice, but both of those hits, you treat your high roll as a 0. So they give you a pretty big damage penalty, but depending on the weapon that you use, you might still have a +5 or a +6 or something to it. So you're still going to be doing some damage, and allows you to kind of mix it up with different things, or if you have abilities that kind of proc on hits or can be activated on hits, you can get some cool things off of it. So yeah, thus far, Fabula Ultima is the one that feels the best to me, because again, depending on how you build your character, you can have some really cool dual wielding things happen. And the way that they deal with that is they just nerf the damage pretty significantly. And that tends to be a relatively common thing to do. Like, again, 5th Edition does the same thing, though the damage nerf is not nearly as big. And then they limit it to you only ever get one extra attack. Because Fabula Ultima, you really generally don't get a ton of extra attacks in Fabula Ultima. they didn't really need to limit it that way. They just limited the damage. And then you look at Pathfinder 3rd edition, stuff like that. They make it so you just hit significantly less with them to kind of balance out the idea of, hey, single weapon fighting or two-handed weapons are still viable. And I haven't really found one that I feel... I haven't really found a system as of yet that makes it feel as cool as playing a Frost Death Knight. And again, part of that is different systems. An MMO is not a tabletop RPG, and it cannot be a tabletop RPG. It was one of the conversations I had when I was doing the Final Fantasy XIV cross D&D Deep Dive series, where specifically for the samurai, they have these abilities where you attack and then the next turn you can do the next part of attack, and then the next turn you do the next part of it, the attack, and you don't get to basically kind of complete your attack for 3 turns. And I mentioned then that that's how it works in... and I think the Monk might have had something like that as well. That's how it works in the Final Fantasy MMO. But Final Fantasy MMO, the time between attacks is 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds, you get to do a new thing. In a tabletop RPG, the time between attacks is anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. So in order for you to do one complete attack, if it takes you an hour to do that, nobody wants to do that. It's just not very fun. I think 13th Age gets around that idea because they have their moves the thing for monks due to the fact that each one of these moves has a specific kind of bonus, and you can kind of mix and match them. So effectively, you're never kind of stuck into 1, 2, 3. You basically have a group of attacks you can do on your first attack, a group of attacks you can do on your second attack, and a group of attacks you can do on your third attack. And each one of those attacks gives you some kind of benefit. And they allow, there are certain abilities that allow you to make multiple attacks in a turn that allow you to basically jump up the ranks and get to the end attacks much faster. Which didn't exist in the Final Fantasy 14 cross D&D the things. It was just, this is your first attack, it does damage. This is your second attack, it does more damage. This is your third attack, it does lots of damage. And that was really boring. So I get MMOs and video games and stuff like that are not tabletop RPGs. But when you think about what inspired tabletop RPGs, things like The Lord of the Rings, Legolas in the book is talked about wielding a pair of knives, very long knives. If you watch the movie, they're closer to kind of like mini little scimitars, because they're easily about that big, so they're pretty damn big. But you get to see like shing, 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 and do all these really cool, interesting things, and that's what inspired D&D, was the ability to kind of make these things. And when the Ranger class was first introduced, I think it was in 2nd edition is when you first started getting Rangers. I might be wrong on that, but I think that's what it was. They were attempting to emulate Aragorn, who was really good with a bow, but also had this really cool sword that he would use, and every so often he'd have multiple weapons that he was using at the same time, because he was just a major badass. Like, that's what he did. So that has always been kind of the power fantasy. And again, that is the template of all tabletop RPGs. D&D is the template of all tabletop RPGs. Yes, there are a lot that are nothing like D&D. You know, look at the really anything that uses a dice pool system. The World of Darkness are probably the most well-known dice pool system. Dice pool basically just means you roll a bunch of dice, and then there's a magic number you have to hit as far as success, and you count the number of successes versus the number of failures. So yes, I understand that there are a lot of tabletop RPGs that are nothing like D&D. However, D&D was the first, and most of these, the reason that they exist is either they were trying to copy D&D or they were trying to do something completely different than D&D. But it was always D&D that they were competing with, and D&D was shaping what they were and weren't going to do. And so yeah, I've just been trying to figure out, is there a tabletop RPG where dual wielding feels very epic and interesting and fun, while also not being so incredibly gonna try this again, so incredibly overpowered that you can't you feel completely underpowered if you are using a great weapon or doing sword and board or something like that. Despite the fact that sword and board is generally not considered a very offensive fighting style and is designed a little bit more towards the idea of defense and protection. Yeah, it's been, as I'm kind of going through this kind of video series where I just talk about game mechanics and things. Combat is always the most complicated, and generally in most RPGs it is the largest part of the rule book, because it needs to be. Combat is generally going to be the most complex aspect of any tabletop RPG. Even ones with very simplistic combat like Fabula Ultima, combat is still the largest part of the book. Most of the classes, most of their abilities are combat abilities. So combat in general is the place where most RPGs are going to kind of make or break the RPG. Again, even if it isn't an emphasis, a lot of the rules for combat are going to exist in other places. Like the rules for combat in D&D 5th edition, the idea you get a move, an action, and a bonus action, that's where people are going to learn the action economy. But the action economy still exists other places. You can have social encounters that still use initiative and still use the action economy. And there are particular abilities that allow you to use bonus actions for more social style things, or things that will use your action that are useful in social situations. And the DM will go, well, you've used your action for this turn, so you can't use that as well. So there are limiting factors to it. As far as Pathfinder 1 and 2, I haven't played them enough to really know how much they deal with. Well, let's put it this way. The people that make Pathfinder 1, at least, said that Pathfinder 1's a combat simulator that accidentally happens to have some role-playing stuff built into it. So combat's the main focus of Pathfinder 1st edition. It technically is probably the main focus of 2nd edition as well, because that's what Pathfinder players really, really enjoy. Super crunchy systems like that tend to excel at combat specifically because it is the most complex aspect of it. And so the more rules that you put in, 90% of rules in Pathfinder and D&D 3rd edition apply to combat specifically. So anyway, like I said, I've been thinking about mechanics and stuff like that, and two-weapon fighting in particular has been a sticking point for me, because again, I just haven't been able to find an RPG where it feels like two-weapon fighting feels good, to be blunt. The closest I've seen is Fabula Ultima, but even then, you still do have to build your character around to two-weapon fighting. It's not kind of like an option you can do sometimes and then not focus on other times, until you get into very high levels. So it's my question for you guys. Do you know an RPG, any tabletop RPG, I don't care what it is, do you know a tabletop RPG where two-weapon fighting feels as cool as it feels in like an action RPG or an MMO, or just how it's described in books like Drizzt using his dual scimitars, or Legolas using his twin elven knives and things like that. Do you know a tabletop RPG that you feel does two-weapon fighting well? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's all for me today. I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.